Hey, welcome to the Azure Cosmos DB conference. I am going to be talking about building a SaaS product with Azure Cosmos DB, and in particular, focusing on how not to overcomplicate things when doing that. I'm Noah. I built Skyplug, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I want to make a first assumption or assertion, which is dependencies are liabilities. And what I mean by that is that when we take dependencies on libraries or on services that are outside of our application or system, we're actually increasing the surface area of pain that we might experience. So if it's a library, we have to understand how it works. We have to configure it correctly. We have to make sure when we upgrade it that we're never breaking something or that we're never introducing a security vulnerability. If it's a service, of course, it can go down, it can have an outage, it can stop working, it can add performance overhead. And at the very least, even if things do work well, we have to understand how these things work, and we have to read documentation. And so really what I'm trying to say is the more dependencies you have, the more bad things can happen. On the contrary, I want to say that simplicity is winning. And what I mean by that is the simpler we can make things, the better for our users and for ourselves. And that requires, I think, mostly getting rid of dependencies or avoiding them. So with that in mind, let's do a little case study, and I'm going to use Skyplug as an example here. So what is Skyplug? It's actually just a SaaS application. It's pretty straightforward. It automates your virtual machines in Azure to turn on and turn off, and you do that on a schedule. So imagine that at 7 a.m. on Monday morning, you want to start up some VMs, maybe it's a terminal server, a build server, whatever, and then at 6 p.m., you're going to turn that back off again. And on the weekends, we're just going to keep them off altogether. Users use that to save a bunch of money on their VM costs. Pretty straightforward proposition, pretty straightforward goal. And the other two goals are just that it just works. It does exactly what I just said. It only does that, and it does it well. And that, very importantly, and what I'll focus on a lot here, is that it always works. It's super reliable, 100% uptime. Every minute of every day of every week of all year long, it's just going to do that scheduling and run those jobs. So with those goals in mind, let's think about like, how would we build this thing? Here's kind of a first draft, or at least how I started thinking about it originally. And this is more or less typical boilerplate kind of architecture. So of course, we know we need a CDN. Every web app needs a CDN. We put our web assets in blob storage and store those along with other assets that we might need that are static and file in nature. We have SignalR up here to do some fancy real-time streaming of updates so the client can always be in sync. We have a bunch of web applications as microservices here behind Traffic Manager, which I'll talk about all this later. We have Azure Functions running in the background. We gravitate towards that because we have seen many tutorials that Azure has put out around how to use functions. A lot of times it's with a change feed, and you read from Cosmos DB. You're using a timer function, perhaps like every minute we would read the database and find out what is our job to run right now. We're going to put that into a queue. That queue is going to feed another function that actually runs the job, and so on. And most importantly, or relevant to the previous point I was just making about reliability, as you know, when we go and select where we want our blob storage or our queue, we have to pick a region. So implicitly, all of this resides in the same region. And that is something that I would say is a problem. So to tell a quick story, in 2018, the original version of Skyplug was actually all hosted in one region that happened to be the Southeast US. And if you were back around in those days, you remember that there was a lightning strike that hit Azure right at the data center and took the whole thing offline for at least 4 days. So basically during that time, all I was able to do was wait for Azure to come back online, repair whatever the lightning did, and just be embarrassed the whole time. So lesson learned from that, you should not put everything in a single region. So this brings us to what I consider to be the baseline pattern going forward, at least for me, which is we need to have multiple regions at the beginning by default and just fundamentally. So in this picture, you can see we have a West US version of Skyplug and East US version of Skyplug. Those are actually self-contained, completely isolated, and they can all, or rather everything inside of this is the full architecture. It can do everything that the system does. And then we just go to it as a user based on a requested traffic manager to say, hey, I want to go to the nearest alive data center and transact with that thing. So this is a fully redundant shared nothing architecture, and it's made possible by Cosmos DB having its geographically separated replication, and that happening transparently in a turnkey fashion. We can really build this out pretty simply with just turning that on and that at the core. So I would suggest that doing that at the beginning, making that decision and having that constraint, that it allowed a lot of simplifications to happen. Let me just go through what some of those were. So remember, I mentioned a CDN up here. The CDN is really something that allows us to distribute content across different regions. But if you remember this picture, we're already doing that to an extent. I could have more regions anywhere I wanted to get content to. So what I opted to do is just remove the CDN altogether and use a static web instance inside of each region as basically what the CDN was supposed to do in the first place. So CDN goes away. We just have regional web instances. One dependency removed. How about Signal R? Well, with Signal R, you have another question there about complexity. There's a two-way communication happening. There is state that has to be maintained. And there is a problem with testing. You never know when data is flowing in which direction. So again, having worked with Signal R quite a bit over time, I found that it was causing more pain sometimes than it was worth. So I just dropped back to simple polling. And you might think, well, polling, that's like the caveman strategy. But honestly, this is about keeping things simple and like removing things, removing fanciness, removing features. So Signal R is gone from the picture. What about Azure Functions? So Azure Functions is just what we see in all the tutorials, and it seems like Azure Functions and Cosmos DB somehow go together. They don't need to be, and you can just use ASP.NET Core and worker services to do all the background processing. That's certainly what I would recommend doing, and I would just steer clear of Azure Functions altogether. It's really just a huge bundle of dependencies, going back to what I was saying earlier. So Azure Functions, gone. What about blob storage? Another thing that we always put in our app architecture right away. We need blob storage, right? Well, Skyplug doesn't use blob storage at all. I was on this path, we're going down this list, and I thought, can I get rid of blob storage? Is that really possible? And indeed it is, at least in my case. So I just use, for all of the things that needed to know, or rather needed to store something in blob storage, I found a way to get them into Cosmos instead. So that included data protection keys, it included certificates, and some other data, nothing heavy, so stuff that would actually fit within a document in Cosmos. So no blob storage, that's gone. How about queues? If you remember my picture before, we need queues to like send jobs out, collect jobs back in where the workers are going to run them. Again, those things are single region. Those things can fail. We don't want to have any single point of failure. So again, I figured, can I get rid of queues? This is actually the most interesting part of this whole project, and I'm sad that I can't show you how this actually was implemented. It's kind of fun, but we use a Cosmos container and treat that as a queue and implement some custom code around it just to do the minimal queue semantics. And what we have in the end is a fully distributed, reliable queue system that allows the Skyplug to do like a consensus around who is going to run schedules at every given minute of the day. So no queues anymore. And then the change feed, this is a little bit, this is just like once you're on this path, you think, how many things can I remove? Change feed was one of these where I thought, well, I've always been a proponent of the change feed in the past, but is it really necessary? And I thought about it, and I couldn't come up with a reason why it was necessary in my case, over and above just a simple polling loop. And so I removed the change feed as well. So that got all of these dependencies, all of these SDK references, everything associated with all of this stuff just disappeared from the system as a consequence of doing that. And so here's what we end up with kind of architecturally. All the stuff you remember around the edges is gone. This is all cleaned up. Azure Functions is replaced by ASP.NET Core services. We still have these microservice things in the middle, and Traffic Manager is feeding everyone to a given region. But if you think about what this represents, really, it's just Cosmos DB, it's Azure App Services, and it is Traffic Manager. That's basically all that is used to run the system. And so it actually ended up being super simple and very easy to maintain. So summary of what I just covered and just a few closing comments, I guess. A fundamental constraint can simplify things. The fundamental constraint that I was referring to is taking the view that you need to have geo-distribution and shared nothing architecture in your system, pretty much no matter what you're doing. And if you do that, you think it would be immediately more complex to achieve that. But in this case, I found it actually forced me to think about things in a more simple way. So it ended up being a win rather than a cost. Again, fewer dependencies mean fewer liabilities. Skyplug is very easy to maintain. It has very few dependencies and libraries in it. And it's just like when it runs perfectly 24 hours a day and with no issues. So there's very little to go wrong and variables in that regard. The other thing, simplicity is something that's good though that requires effort. So we can't get it just by default. I think the assumption I used to make was, well, you start with an empty project. It's simple right away, right? But the process is always, you're going to end up with complexity and you're not going to have a simple result unless you really try, because it's too tempting to add in every new service, every new shiny thing that we come across that would seem cool to add into our system. So you got to resist that. And I guess finally, it's just, for us at this conference, it's the fact that Azure Cosmos DB is uniquely suited to enable this architecture, I think is really the cool killer feature here, that at least that I was able to take advantage of to make this app really easy to develop. So with that, I thank you for watching. If you want to reach out, if you have any questions about what I covered, curiosities, or just want to criticize this idea or something, you can do that. My email is right here, and then the website for the app, if you want to check out what that looks like, is down here. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully you learned something, and I hope you have a good rest of the conference. Thanks.